Today, I want to share a story so tense it lingers long after the final word. Unfolding across the harsh plains of the Old West, where cold wind cuts like a blade and mercy is rarely offered. This is a place where rumors travel faster than truth, and a woman alone can become a target before she ever speaks her name. It all started with a simple arrival. A stagecoach stopping in a town that had already decided her fate. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The stagecoach groaned like a wounded beast as it lurched to a stop, its wheels coughing up clouds of red frontier dust. For several heartbeats, Willa Dane did not move. She sat stiffly on the narrow bench, her gloved fingers clenched around a weather-scarred leather satchel resting in her lap. Beyond the window, the town of Hollow Creek, Montana, waited in silence. It did not look like the beginning of anything. It looked like where endings came to die. A single broad street cut through the settlement, lined with crooked wooden buildings whose false fronts leaned inward as if bracing themselves against the endless wind. Nothing here felt welcoming. Nothing felt alive. The wind was the first thing Willa had noticed when the coach slowed. A sharp, cutting presence spilling down from the black pine slopes of the mountains looming above the town. It carried the scent of sap and cold stone, and something wilder beneath it, something untamed. It raised the fine hairs along her arms even before she drew her first breath. She pushed open the flimsy coach door and stepped down. Her boots sank into the rust-colored dirt. She straightened the front of her dark wool traveling dress, proper, modest, and entirely out of place here. It belonged on the paved sidewalks of Ohio, not on a frontier that felt jagged and unforgiving. She felt the eyes immediately. A woman beating dust from a rug above the street froze mid-motion. Two men leaning against a hitching post stopped carving at their sticks. Conversations faltered. Silence crept outward. Willa felt their stares settle on her like weight, measuring, judging, stripping her down to what she was and what she was not. An outsider. A stranger washed ashore where she did not belong. The instructions in her uncle's precise, cramped handwriting echoed in her mind. She was to go straight to the general store and ask for Mr. Voss. The letter inside her satchel, the one that decided her future, was addressed to him. Her grip tightened as she crossed the street toward the largest building in town. The faded sign above its porch read, Mercer Lane Mercantile, the paint worn thin by years of wind and sun. The bell over the door rang sharply as she stepped inside. Warmth met her first. Then the smells: coffee beans, cured leather, old dust. A pot-bellied stove glowed faintly near the center of the room. Behind the long wooden counter stood a thin man with graying hair at his temples, peering down at a ledger. He looked up slowly, spectacles perched low on his nose. "Help you, miss?" he asked, his voice flat and guarded. "I'm here to see Mr. Voss," Willa said. Her words sounded too soft in the stillness. "I was told he'd be expecting me." The shopkeeper, who she would later learn was Mercer Lane, removed his spectacles and wiped them with the hem of his apron. He did not hurry. Every motion was deliberate. "Voss?" he repeated. It was not a question. "Yes, sir. I have a letter for him." Mercer exhaled slowly, the sound heavy with resignation. "Well now, miss, I'm afraid you came a long way for nothing. We buried Voss 2 weeks ago. Thrown from his horse up on the ridge. Broke his neck clean." The words reached her ears, but not her understanding. Willa stared at him, waiting for him to continue, to correct himself, to say there had been some mistake. But his face held only pity. That look, the same one the neighbors had worn after her parents died of fever. The look that said she was something unfortunate, something burdensome. "Dead," she whispered. Cold spread through her chest like ice cracking open. Everything, every fragile plan her uncle had built to spare her a life of dependence, had rested on Bran Voss. And now he was gone. A woman near the back of the store spoke without lowering her voice. "Poor dear came all that way," she murmured. "What'll she do now?" The words cut deeper than they should have. The room swayed. Willa caught herself against the counter, her breath shallow. There was nowhere to go. Her uncle had sold her parents' house to pay for her journey west. There was no return path, no refuge waiting behind her. She was adrift, a ship without harbor or compass. "You got kin here?" Mercer asked, softer now. "Family nearby?" She shook her head. Her throat had closed entirely. "Well then," a slurred voice interrupted from the doorway. "Sounds like the little lady needs herself a place to land." A man stumbled inside, bringing whiskey fumes and cold air with him. Dirt streaked his coat. His mouth twisted into something mean. His close-set eyes slid over Willa with a familiarity that made her skin crawl. "I got room," he grinned, yellow teeth flashing. "Plenty of it." He stepped closer. "Good space for a pretty thing like you." Willa recoiled instinctively, her back pressing to the counter. Around them, the store went still. No one moved, no one spoke. In their eyes, she was already fallen. A mail-order bride with no groom, free for the taking. "That won't be necessary," she said, her voice shaking. "I'll manage." "Oh, now, don't be shy." The man reached for her arm. Before his fingers could touch her, a shadow fell across the floor. The light dimmed. Willa looked up. A man stood in the doorway. So tall, so broad, he seemed to block the daylight entirely. He wore buckskin darkened by age and weather. His beard was thick, his hair long and untamed. He did not speak. He simply looked at the drunk. His eyes were pale gray, cold and steady as riverstone. The man's grin vanished. He shrank beneath that gaze, took a step back. "Just being friendly," he muttered, hands raised. He glanced around for support and found none. Then he turned and hurried out, like a rat flushed from a barn. The stranger watched him go. Only then did his eyes shift, to Willa. She braced herself for judgment, but there was none. Only stillness, quiet assessment. He gave a faint nod, then turned to the counter. "Flour, salt, coffee," he said. His voice was deep and rough, unused to conversation. Mercer Lane hurried to gather the goods. The tension slowly drained from the room. But for Willa Dane, everything had already changed. And the man who stood between her and ruin was named Thorne Kess. He had not been there a breath earlier. Now he filled the doorway. The man was tall, unnaturally so, his shoulders broad beneath buckskin, darkened by years of wind and weather. Worn leather wrapped his frame. A thick beard shadowed his jaw, and his long hair fell loose and untrimmed about his shoulders. He did not speak. He did not need to. He simply fixed his gaze on the drunk. His eyes were a striking shade of gray, clear, sharp, and cold as riverstone in winter. The man's crooked grin wavered. His confidence withered beneath that silent scrutiny. He took a hesitant step back. "All I meant was friendly," he muttered, lifting his hands in surrender. He searched the store for support and found none. Faces turned away. The room offered him no allies. With a curse under his breath, he backed toward the door and slipped outside like a rat fleeing lamplight. The large man watched him leave. His expression never changed. Then those gray eyes shifted to Willa Dane. She braced herself, expecting judgment, or worse, the same hunger she had seen in the other man's stare. Instead, she found nothing of the sort. Only a calm, weighing stillness, a quiet measure of who she was. He inclined his head once, barely noticeable, then turned toward the counter where Mercer Lane stood frozen. "Flour, salt, coffee," the man said. His voice was low and rough, like thunder carried from far-off hills. A voice unused to company, each word shaped with care. Mercer blinked and hurried to gather the supplies. Slowly, the tension eased. The woman examining calico resumed her shopping. Someone coughed. The moment passed. But for Willa, nothing would ever be the same. The ground beneath her had collapsed, and the only thing standing between her and disaster had been this silent stranger. He paid in coin, gathered his bundle, and turned toward the door. Then he paused. He looked back at her. "You got someplace to go?" he asked. The words were clipped, plain. She shook her head, shame and fear twisting together in her chest. For a long moment, he said nothing. His gaze drifted toward the mountains visible through the grime-streaked window, as if measuring something unseen. "I've got a cabin," he said at last. "Temporary, until you find another way." The offer hung in the air, blunt, unexpected, unadorned. Mercer stopped mid-motion. The woman with the fabric stared openly now. Every instinct told Willa to refuse. This man was a stranger, a mountain giant who looked carved from timber and stone, a wild thing of the high ridges. But what choice did she have? To remain in a town where women whispered behind their hands and men measured her worth with their eyes? To beg for mercy? Her pride, what little she had left, would not allow it. She searched his face for deceit and found none. No charm, no persuasion, no promise beyond shelter. He was not offering kindness, he was offering survival. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I accept." A murmur rippled through the store. Mercer Lane frowned. Someone gasped. But Willa lifted her chin and met their stares. Their judgment no longer mattered. They had given her nothing but suspicion. This man had offered her a roof. They left the town together, heading toward the rising foothills beyond Hollow Creek. As they walked, she finally asked his name. He did not volunteer it. "Thorn Kess," he said after a pause. He walked ahead of her, his long strides devouring the path. She nearly had to jog to keep pace. He took her satchel without comment, carrying it as though it weighed nothing. The trail up Briar Ridge was barely a path at all, just a narrow trace twisting through pine and stone. The climb was punishing. Loose rock shifted beneath her boots. The thin air burned her lungs. They crossed a narrow gorge on two logs bound by warped planks. Below, melt water roared through the ravine, icy and violent. Later, they forded a shallow but fast-moving creek. The freezing water soaked her boots and hem, numbing her legs to the bone. Thorn Kess moved through it all with quiet ease, as though the land itself recognized him. He never reached for her, never touched her, but at the most dangerous stretches, he would stop and wait, not urging, not leaving, just standing until she found her footing. They reached the cabin as the sun sank low, streaking the western sky with brutal shades of orange and violet. The structure was small but solid. Hand-hewn logs tucked among a stand of aspen. Smoke curled faintly from a stone chimney. It stood utterly alone, a fragile mark of human life against a vast, indifferent wilderness. Inside, the space was sparse, yet clean. And for the first time since she had stepped off the stagecoach, Willa Dane realized she might survive the night. A stone hearth claimed most of the far wall. Beside it stood a rough-cut table, two mismatched chairs, and a narrow bed framed into one corner, layered with a heavy fur throw. Opposite that, along the back wall, rested a second sleeping space. No more than clean straw laid thick and covered with folded wool blankets. Thorn Kess motioned toward it. "You can sleep there." He said little else that night. He moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, feeding the fire, setting a pot over the coals, preparing a plain supper of beans and salt pork. They ate without speaking. The silence was not uncomfortable, but it carried weight, thick with questions neither of them dared voice. Willa Dane was beyond tired. Her body ached from the climb. Her mind still reeled from the day's blows. When she lay down on the straw pallet, she drew the coarse blankets up to her chin, watching firelight dance across the log walls. Thorn sat near the hearth, methodically cleaning a long rifle. Every motion was practiced, exact. The warmth made her heavy-lidded, yet sleep would not come. Then the sound reached her. A long, rising howl rolled through the night. Another answered, closer. Wolves. Cold rushed through her veins. Willa bolted upright, heart pounding violently. The sound was raw and ancient, a reminder of how far she was from roads, churches, and safety. How exposed she truly was. Thorn did not react with alarm. He finished wiping the rifle, set it aside, then picked it up again. He crossed the room and lowered himself onto a small stool near the door, only a few feet from where she lay. He did not look at her. He simply leaned back against the wall and laid the rifle across his lap. The barrel faced outward. He must have sensed her fear because his voice carried softly through the firelit dark. "My gun always points out," he said, eyes fixed on the thick wooden door. "Never in." The words were plain, almost casual. Yet to Willa, they landed with the weight of an oath. He was not merely guarding her body. He was guarding his own code. The rifle was meant to keep the world out, not to bring danger inside his walls. Something fragile shifted within her. Outside, the wolves continued their song. But it sounded farther away now, their threat dulled by the steady presence seated in the darkness. Willa lay back down. Her muscles remained tight, but the panic in her chest eased. She listened to the pop of embers, to the slow rhythm of Thorn's breathing. She would not run. There was nowhere to run to. And for the first time that day, a dangerous thought flickered alive inside her. This place, this harsh, lonely mountain, might be shelter. It might even become home, if she dared to trust. Morning came cold and bright. Pale sunlight filtered through the single greased paper window, painting the cabin in muted gold. Willa had been awake for some time, listening to the strange language of the mountain, the sharp cry of a jay, the scrape of something small moving through dry leaves. Across the room, Thorn slept beneath a worn wool blanket. She watched the steady rise and fall of his broad shoulders. In daylight, he seemed less like a figure of legend and more like a man, still imposing, still silent, but human. A wave of disorientation washed over her. She was in a stranger's cabin, miles from a town that had already judged her, with no money, no future promised. Fear threatened to take hold again, until memory steadied her. The rifle across his lap. My gun always points out. Never in. The thought anchored her. She rose. Motion was the only cure for despair. Barefoot, she crossed the packed earth floor without a sound. The cabin reflected its owner. Practical, stripped of comfort. The cooking area held a dry sink, a few iron pots on hooks, and a narrow pantry cupboard. She opened it. Inside lay the supplies he'd purchased: flour, salt, coffee, alongside beans and dried corn. Food for survival, not indulgence. She decided to make coffee. It was a small thing, ordinary. And ordinary was what she needed. She found the grinder. The rough rasp of beans breaking filled the cabin. A domestic sound, grounding and purposeful. By the time Thorne stirred and sat upright, the dark, rich scent of coffee mingled with wood smoke drifting from the banked hearth. He said nothing. His gray eyes followed her as she poured the steaming liquid into 2 tin mugs. She set one on the crate beside his bed. He gave a single nod. The gesture was slight, but it felt like conversation. And so their days began to find a rhythm, a quiet exchange of shared space and solitary labor. Willa took charge of the cooking, turning simple stores into thick stews and cornbread baked in a Dutch oven over the coals. She unearthed her sewing kit and began mending his clothes. A sleeve torn at the elbow, buckskin worn thin at the knee. Her fingers, accustomed to fine cloth, struggled at first with the heavy hides. The needle resisted. The work was slow, but she persisted, and as she stitched, something else began to mend as well. At times, Willa Dane felt as though she were sewing her own life back together, one careful stitch at a time. Each mended seam, each warm meal, carved out a small pocket of order inside a world that had nearly unraveled. Thorne Kess never remarked on the changes. He ate what she cooked without comment, never offering praise. Yet his plate was always scraped clean. When he pulled on a shirt she had repaired, the patch lay straight and strong, holding fast beneath his broad movement. His answers were never spoken. They lived in his actions. One morning, she woke to find a solid 3-legged stool placed beside her straw pallet. Its surface had been smoothed by hand. He had seen her crouching on the hard floor while sewing, and said nothing. Another dawn, after a bitter night of frost, a basin of steaming water waited near the hearth. He had risen before daylight to heat it for her. These quiet kindnesses settled deep, like stones dropped into a well, sending ripples far beyond their weight. Between them grew a fragile language, built not of words, but of noticing. One evening, as cold rain drummed steadily against the cabin roof, Willa finally found the courage to speak. She was kneading dough for the next day's bread, her hands dusted white with flour. "My father was a judge," she said softly. The sentence echoed louder than she expected. Thorne looked up from the blade he was honing. "Back in Ohio," she added. "Judge Halden Price." He waited. "He was a good man," she continued, "an honest one. But honesty makes enemies." She told him of the feud, a bitter land dispute her father had ruled upon. The family he ruled against had been powerful, vindictive. After her father's death, their hatred had turned toward her. "My uncle panicked," she said. "He thought marrying me off would make me disappear." Thorne's jaw tightened. "Bran Voss," he said. The name came out flat. "He was no prize," Thorne went on. "A loud fool, but his kin, they weren't the same family," Willa finished quietly. "I know." Her uncle had heard only the name Voss and believed it would hide her among enemies of her enemies. She gave a short, bitter laugh. "He sent me from one fire straight into another." Thorne set the whetstone aside and met her gaze. "Your father made enemies by doing what was right," he said. "That carries a heavy cost." The word struck something loose inside her. For the first time since her father's death, someone understood, not the inconvenience, not the danger, but the honor. Her throat tightened. "And you?" she asked. You live up here alone. Did you make enemies too?" His face closed. He stared into the fire, jaw set. Silence stretched long enough that she regretted the question. Then he spoke. "I was a soldier." His voice was rougher now. "At the forts along the Laramie Trail." He lifted a piece of kindling and turned it slowly in his hands. "I had a wife, Althea, and a daughter, Nell." The name sounded unfamiliar on his tongue, objects long buried. "We had a small place near the fort," he said. "I thought it was safe." He did not describe what came after. He did not need to. The truth lived in the lines carved beside his eyes, in the permanent winter of his expression. A raid. Sudden. Merciless. The kind of violence that haunted every frontier household. He had lost everything. They sat without speaking as rain tapped the roof and fire cracked softly between them. Two pasts laid bare in the narrow circle of light. They were no longer strangers bound by chance. They were survivors. Each carrying wounds the other could not see, but now understood. Their quiet life held for 2 weeks. Then it shattered. A rider came up from Hollow Creek. A lanky youth named Jory Finch made the grueling climb to the cabin. His horse was lathered, his face pale from the effort. He carried a letter. It was addressed to Miss Willa Dane. The envelope was thick, the handwriting graceful and slanted, too careful to bring comfort. Willa accepted it with a tightening in her chest. Before she broke the seal, she already knew. Peace rarely rode this far into the mountains. The letter bore the seal of the Hollow Creek women. Even the name felt like judgment pressed into paper. Willa Dane's hands trembled as she read the words aloud. The tone was syrup-sweet and sanctimonious, soaked in false concern. It spoke of her unfortunate circumstances and the impropriety of her current residence. It claimed her behavior cast a shadow upon the moral standing of the town. For the sake of her soul and her reputation, she was commanded to return to Hollow Creek. There, she would remain for 6 days under the supervision of the Society's president, Dorothea Vane, to receive instruction in modesty, propriety, and Christian virtue. The final lines were carefully sharpened. Should she refuse, the Society would be forced to assume she was a woman of questionable morals and would notify the broader community accordingly. They would mark her. The paper shook violently in Willa's grasp. Heat flooded her cheeks, shame burning sharp and sudden. They were calling her a harlot, wrapping the accusation in scripture and polite ink. After everything she had endured, after all she had lost, this was her reward. Thorne Kess, who had listened without interruption, took the letter from her hands. He read it once. Then his jaw tightened. A muscle jumped along his cheek. Without a word, he crushed the paper into a fist and hurled it into the fire. Flames leapt bright, devouring the page until nothing remained but curling black ash. "You will not go," he said. It was not advice. It was command. "And then what?" Willa cried, her voice breaking. "Hide here forever?" "They'll destroy me," she said. "They'll spread lies. I'll never be able to walk among people again. Not here, not anywhere." The old instinct surged back, the need to flee, to disappear before judgment could land. But where could she run? The next morning, while sorting her satchel, her fingers brushed a small cloth-wrapped bundle tucked deep at the bottom. She had forgotten it entirely. Inside lay a handful of flower seeds, zinnias and marigolds, saved by Miriam Dane from their garden back in Ohio. They felt like artifacts from another life, fragile, hopeful, almost cruel in this rocky land. On a sudden impulse, born of quiet defiance, Willa fetched an empty tin can from the refuse pile. She filled it with soil gathered from the aspen grove, her fingers numbing in the cold as she pressed the dirt down gently. One by one, she planted the tiny seeds. Then she placed the can on the narrow window ledge, where morning light might find it. It was foolish. A prayer poured into rusted metal. But it was also refusal. A refusal to believe this mountain was nothing but endings. A declaration that something living might yet take root, even here. Thorn watched from the doorway. He did not smile. He did not mock her hope. He simply stood, silent. And in that silence, she felt something close to acceptance. The memory of the letter lay between them like a coiled snake. They did not speak of it again, yet its poison lingered in the air. With every passing hour, the 6-day deadline drew nearer. To go meant submitting to their verdict, their authority. To stay meant exile. Her name dragged through whispers, her honor stripped away. On the evening of the 5th day, Willa stood at the window, staring at the tin can. The sun bled across the sky in violent color behind the blackened peaks. She had been running all her life. Running from the Voss feud, running from poverty, running from the pity in her uncle's eyes. She had crossed half the continent, only to realize she was still running. "I'm tired of hiding," she whispered to her reflection. Behind her, Thorn sat at the table cleaning his rifle, the same way he had on their first night. He stopped, his hands stilled. "They want me to feel dirty," she said, turning to face him. "Worthless. And if I stay up here, I'm letting them win. I'm agreeing with them." He met her gaze. He did not argue. He did not command. He waited. And in that quiet patience, he returned something she thought she had lost forever. Her choice. Willa drew a slow breath. "I will go down there," she said. "I will face them." She held his eyes. "But I will not go alone." A long moment passed. Then Thorn set the rifle gently on the table. The sound was soft, but final. He rose to his full height, filling the cabin not with sighs, but with resolve. "No more running," he said. It was not anger. It was a vow. "We go together." The descent from Briar Ridge felt like stepping into another world. Above, life had been simple: rock and pine, fire and survival. Below waited judgment, and neither of them intended to bow. Down in the valley, Hollow Creek felt different. The air itself seemed crowded with eyes. Before they ever reached the main street, Willa sensed them. Glances slipping through lace curtains, shapes pausing behind glass. A crawling awareness along the back of her neck that told her the town was already watching. She wore her best dress, the same dark wool she had arrived in weeks before. Now scrubbed clean, brushed smooth, pressed as carefully as she could manage over open flame. Her hair was braided tight enough to ache, drawn back like armor. Beside her walked Thorn Kess. He had not changed his buckskins, nor softened his expression, yet his presence spoke louder than words. He was not hiding her. He was not ashamed. He walked at her side in full daylight. They were not sneaking. They were facing the town that had judged them both without ever asking the truth. The town hall rose at the end of the street, a square, unadorned building, the largest in Hollow Creek aside from the Mercantile. On Sundays it served as a church. When the circuit judge passed through, it became a courtroom. Today, it was something else entirely, a tribunal. As they stepped inside, stale cold air rushed over them. Rows of wooden pews stretched toward a raised platform, and every bench was filled. It seemed the entire Hollow Creek folk had gathered for the spectacle. The Hollow Creek women occupied the front rows, stiff-backed, lips tight, bonnets pinned like battle helmets. At the center of the platform sat a woman with a pinched mouth and sharp eyes, her expression permanently sour. Willa recognized her at once. Dorothea Vane. The room fell silent as Willa and Thorn entered. Every head turned. Whispers slid through the crowd like dry leaves skittering across frozen ground. Thorn ignored them. His gaze stayed forward. He guided Willa not to the back, but to a pew near the front, directly behind the Women's Society. They sat. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. Dorothea Vane cleared her throat, a thin sound, like a pebble striking tin. "We are gathered here," she began, her voice high and eager, "to address a matter of serious concern to the moral foundation of our community." Her eyes swept the room before settling on Willa. A young woman, Miss Willa Dane, arrived among us under circumstances both tragic and irregular. She paused, letting the word hang. Without family, without protection, without proper means. Willa felt heat creep into her cheeks. She stared at her hands, clenched so tightly in her lap, her knuckles burned white. Beside her, Thorn sat motionless, solid as stone. "She has chosen," Dorothea continued, chest lifting, "to reside in an arrangement most unconventional. One that has, quite rightly, become the subject of concern." The Hollow Creek women nodded in unison. "Our society," Dorothea said, "offered Christian guidance, a respectable roof, instruction in propriety." Her lips thinned. That offer was disregarded. The word struck like a gavel. Disregarded, as if their opinion carried the weight of law. "Therefore," Dorothea declared, voice rising, "Miss Dane must answer for her choices. She must explain before this community why she has elected a path of impropriety." Every gaze snapped toward Willa. This was it. The moment meant to break her. She drew in a trembling breath, preparing to rise, though she had no idea what she would say. Before she could stand, a woman sprang to her feet, Ione Brask, known across Hollow Creek for a mouth sharper than any skinning blade. Her face was flushed, eyes blazing with self-righteous fire. "Let's speak plain," she shrieked, stabbing a finger toward Willa. The room went dead still. "We all know the truth. At 19, she was sent here, still pure after her intended past." Ione paused dramatically. "Sent straight to that mountain giant." Gasps rippled through the hall. "What happened next should shock us all," she continued, voice rising. "He took her up to that cabin, alone, for weeks." She spread her hands. What explanation does anyone need for that? The murmurs exploded, excited, scandalized, hungry, still pure. The words were meant to wound, to twist her grief into filth. Willa felt the room tilt. Darkness edged her vision. Her breath came shallow, uneven. Then, a floorboard creaked. Thorn Kess stood, slowly, deliberately, and the sound of him rising cut through the noise like a blade. Thorn Kess rose to his full height. The effect was immediate. The low murmuring in the hall collapsed into silence, as if someone had slammed a door shut. He did not turn toward Dorothea Vane on her raised platform. Instead, he faced the room, the entire town. His gray eyes, cold, steady, unblinking, swept slowly across the Hollow Creek folk. Wherever his gaze landed, people shifted. Shoulders drew inward, spines bent. Even Ione Brask, so shrill moments earlier, sank back into her pew, her mouth left slightly open. Thorn did not look at Willa. He did not need to. His body itself was a barrier, a living wall between her and the poison in the air. He stepped once into the aisle, His boots struck the wooden floor with a heavy, final sound. When he spoke, he did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. "There is no legal bond between us," he said. Each word was placed carefully, clean and deliberate. "But my conscience bears responsibility for her safety. I offered her shelter. I will continue to do so. Her honor and her well-being rest with me." Silence followed, deep, stunned. The town had expected shouting, denial, excuses, perhaps even abandonment. They had not expected this. Not a defense, a declaration. He was not asking permission. He was not justifying himself. He was stating a truth as solid as the mountains beyond the valley. From several rows back, a rough voice broke the stillness. It was Garin Holt, the blacksmith, his arms thick as split oak. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, just loud enough to carry. Mountain Man finally speaks. Beside him, Elsbeth Moore, flour still dusting her apron, leaned toward her husband. "He doesn't say much," she whispered softly, a small smile touching her lips. "But when he does, it lands." A ripple moved through the room. The spell of condemnation cracked. On the platform, Dorothea Vane's face tightened with fury. Her control, so carefully staged, had slipped from her grasp. Her authority undone by a man who had spoken fewer than a dozen sentences. Thorne turned his head slightly. He looked at Willa, not gently, not harshly. A quiet command passed between them. "Stand." She understood. Drawing strength from somewhere deep and unfamiliar, Willa rose. She did not stare at the floor. She did not fold inward. Her back straightened, her chin lifted. She met the stares of the Hollow Creek folk, curious, unsettled, some angry, some uncertain. She stepped forward until she stood beside Thorne, not behind him, together. Two figures alone before a town that no longer felt so certain of its righteousness. Several people shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. The judgment that had once felt absolute now wavered. A few of the Hollow Creek women looked at Willa differently, still guarded, but no longer cruel. Others, like Dorothea Vane and Ione Brask, glared harder than before. They had not been persuaded. They had been defied, and that made them furious. Thorne inclined his head once toward the door. Without another word, they turned and walked down the center aisle. The crowd parted instinctively, as if drawn aside by an unseen force. No one spoke. No one tried to stop them. Their footsteps echoed through the hollow room as they passed into the cold daylight beyond. Outside, the sun felt sharper, cleaner. The air tasted like freedom. They had faced the town, and they had not broken. But as they neared the edge of Hollow Creek, with the meeting hall behind them, a figure detached from the shadows between the saloon and the land office. A lean man, wire-thin, his face twisted by long-held resentment. Small dark eyes tracked Willa's back with unsettling focus. Calder Voss. His brother Bran Voss had been a fool, dead by his own recklessness. But Riek Voss had been different. Riek had been hanged 2 years earlier, by the order of a traveling judge from Ohio, a man named Judge Halden Price. Calder had heard the whispers, followed the trail, watched quietly when the mail-order bride arrived. And now he had seen everything. The girl had found herself a new protector, a big one. Calder Voss smiled, a slow, crooked twist of his mouth. Let the town argue morality. He wasn't interested in her honor at all. Calder Voss was not interested in forgiveness. He was interested in justice, his family's kind of justice. The storm of gossip and judgment in Hollow Creek had passed. For now, But something far more dangerous had begun to gather beyond the town's reach, and it followed them up the narrow trail toward Briar Ridge. The climb back to the cabin passed in silence. The weight of the town hall still clung to them like cold fog. They had survived the confrontation, but it was not a true victory. Nothing had been resolved, only postponed. The high forest, once a place of refuge for Willa Dane, no longer felt gentle. The trees seemed alert. The wind threading through the pines whispered like rumor carried on breath. They lived the next several days on edge. Thorn Kess was gone for long stretches, not hunting, but circling the land that surrounded the cabin. His gaze tracked broken twigs, pressed grass, faint marks in the soil. Each time he returned with no proof of danger, yet the hard line of his jaw never eased. Willa startled at every unfamiliar sound, the snap of a branch, the shrill cry of a hawk, the dull thud of a falling cone. The fragile peace they had built had splintered, replaced by quiet fear. On the third night, the cold sharpened. A hard frost spread across the mountain, turning the world silver and black beneath a thin blade of moonlight. Inside the cabin, the hearth burned bright, but its warmth could not reach the chill settled deep in Willa's bones. She sat mending a tear in her dress, stitching tight, careful lines, as if order could still be sewn into a world coming undone. Across from her, Thorn cleaned his rifle for the third time that day. Each movement measured, intentional, almost ceremonial. Then the forest went silent. Not gradually, but all at once. The usual night sounds vanished, as if the wilderness itself had drawn breath and held it. Thorn's head lifted sharply, his hands stilled, his eyes locked on the door. He gave Willa a slight motion of his head, a wordless command to remain quiet. Then they heard it. The slow crunch of a boot on frozen ground. Not an animal. A man, trying and failing to move unseen. The steps circled the cabin once before stopping on the rough porch. Willa's pulse leapt into her throat. Her needle froze mid-stitch. The silence pressed thick and suffocating. "Willa Dane?" A voice called from the darkness. It was raspy, pleasant in tone but false beneath it, like a smile hiding teeth. "I know you're in there. I just want a word." A hunter pretending to be friendly. Thorn rose in one smooth motion, soundless as shadow. He motioned Willa toward the far corner of the cabin, away from the door and the single window. Then he crossed to the hearth, lifted the heavy iron poker, and placed it in her hands. His eyes held a single message. If it comes to that. He returned to the center of the room, rifle loose but ready in his grip. He did not open the door. Instead, his voice rolled outward, low, steady, unafraid. "She has nothing to say to you," Thorn said. "If you've got business, you speak it to me, or you leave." A short, humorless chuckle answered him. "My business ain't with you, mountain man," the voice replied. "It's with the girl. Her father wronged my family. There's a debt still owed." Calder Voss. The name confirmed Willa's worst fear. This wasn't about gossip or morality. This was the old feud, dragged 2,000 miles across the country to find her again. "This cabin's too small for settling scores," Thorn replied calmly. He began moving toward the door. "If you want to talk debts, we do it outside. Man to man." Understanding struck Willa with icy clarity. He was pulling the danger away from her, drawing it into the open, into the forest, where Thorn Kess belonged. "You come out alone," Calder Voss rasped. "No tricks." "Alone," Thorn answered. He glanced once at Willa. "Stay hidden. Stay alive." Then he lifted the heavy wooden bar, opened the door, and stepped into the freezing night, pulling it shut behind him. A different silence filled the cabin. A terrible one. Willa crept to the wall, pressing her ear against the rough logs, straining to hear something, anything. But there was only the pounding of her own heart. The iron poker felt useless in her shaking hands. Minutes stretched into something endless. She waited for a voice, a shout, a gunshot. Nothing came. Only the wind whispering through the trees as her mind painted horrors that she could not see. Somewhere beyond the cabin walls, fate was unfolding in the dark. Two figures moved through the frozen timber in Willa Dane's mind. One steady and silent, the other driven by spite. She imagined Thorn Kess slipping through the darkness with the land itself on his side. Then the night shattered. A single rifle shot split the mountain air, sharp, violent, final. The sound slammed against the cliffs and echoed once before, vanishing into the endless black. Willa cried out, her hand flying to her mouth as terror seized her chest. She did not know who had fired. She did not know who had fallen. The silence that followed was worse than the gunshot itself. It pressed in on her, heavy and suffocating. She stood frozen, breath locked in her lungs, her thoughts spiraling into every possible horror. Then, movement. Not the cautious tread from before, but a heavier step. Familiar. The latch scraped. The door swung inward. Thorn Kess stood in the opening, his massive frame cut in silver by moonlight. He was alone. He stepped inside and dropped the bar back into place. His movement was stiff, uneven. "Are you hurt?" Willa whispered, her voice barely sound at all. "He's gone," Thorn said. His tone was strained. "For now." He took one step closer to the fire, and the truth revealed itself. A dark stain spread across his shoulder, soaking through the buckskin. His left arm hung useless at his side. "You're bleeding," she gasped, rushing toward him. "It grazed me," he said. But his face was ashen, sweat shining across his brow. He sank heavily into the chair beside the table. "He fired from the trees," Thorn added. "Didn't see him till it was already done." Fear snapped into something sharper. Purpose. Willa tore a clean strip of cloth from a spare petticoat in her satchel. She fetched the basin and brought it to the table. Her hands trembled, but her thoughts did not. "Take off your shirt," she said. There was no hesitation in her voice. He grunted as he worked the buckskin loose. The bullet had carved a long, bloody groove across the thick muscle of his upper arm. Not deep, but ugly and bleeding hard. She began to clean it. At first, her touch was uncertain, then steadier. She focused entirely on the task. This she could do. She could mend this. As the blood washed away, her stomach tightened. Bits of grit and stone were embedded in the torn flesh. He wasn't alone, Thorn said through clenched teeth. "I found 2 sets of tracks near the cabin. Not wandering tracks. They knew the trail." Cold spread through her chest. This hadn't been reckless revenge. It had been planned. Calder Voss had help. Men who knew the mountain. Men who knew how to hunt it. They were not facing one enemy, but many. Willa finished cleaning the wound as carefully as she could. She wrapped the cloth tight, pulling it into a firm pressure bandage. Her hands no longer shook. Something inside her had gone still. Hard, clear, unyielding. When she tied the final knot, her head was bent close to his arm. She felt the heat of his skin, smelled pine sap, sweat iron. He did not flinch. He let her tend him in silence. In his stillness, his vulnerability, something fierce rose inside her, a protectiveness so sudden it stole her breath. Thorn looked down at her. The wall he always carried had fallen away. In its place lay grief, raw and exposed. "I've lost too much," he said quietly. The words barely rose above the crackling fire. He lifted his uninjured hand and touched her cheek. His rough fingers were unexpectedly gentle. "You won't be one of them." It was not just a promise. It was a confession. A man who had sealed himself off from the world was speaking from the deepest wound he carried. He wasn't only guarding her life. He was guarding the last light left in his own. Tears blurred Willa's vision. She didn't hide them. She simply met his gaze. And in that long, wordless moment, something fragile turned solid, tempered by fear, sealed by choice. They sat like that for a long time. The fire burned low. Cold crept back into the cabin. Neither noticed. The danger had passed, for tonight. But now it had a name, and that name had allies. At last, Willa Dane rose and crossed the room to where Thorn Kess's rifle rested against the wall. She studied it. The long, dark barrel, the smooth stock polished by years of use. It was a thing made for death. Yet it was also a thing meant for survival. She turned back toward him. Thorn was watching her closely, fatigue etched into his face, but his eyes remained sharp. "This isn't finished," she said. Her voice was low but steady. "They'll come again, and I won't be something you have to shield." She swallowed, drawing breath deep into her lungs. "I won't be helpless." Her fingers tightened around the rifle. The words felt unfamiliar, dangerous even, but once spoken, they settled with certainty. "Teach me," she said. "Teach me how to shoot." Thorn studied her for a long moment. He looked from her determined face to the rifle, then back again. He saw the fear still there, but beneath it, something harder, something newly forged. She was no longer the frightened young woman who had arrived in Hollow Creek with nothing but shame and grief. She was someone who had chosen her ground and intended to hold it. At last, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "All right," he said. He pushed himself upright, pain visible in the tightness of his jaw, but resolve carrying him forward. "But you learn my way," he added. "There's one rule. You never break it." He met her gaze fully now. "You fire only when there's no other path left." The lessons began the following morning. The rifle felt enormous in Willa's arms. Unbalanced, heavy, unforgiving. Thorn's bandaged shoulders served as constant reminder of why this knowledge mattered. He did not begin with shooting. He began with respect. He made her hold the weapon until she understood its weight, taught her the names of each piece, showed her how to load it slowly, deliberately. His movements were careful, exact, his good arm doing the labor of two. Then came aiming. Her shoulders burned as she held the barrel steady, sighting along its length at a dark knot high on a distant pine. The world narrowed until nothing existed beyond that single point. In the afternoons, the mountain rang with a new sound, the sharp, steady bite of an axe striking wood. Thorn had begun cutting trees on a slope below the cabin. His shoulder had not yet healed fully. She could see the pain carved around his eyes each time the blade fell. But he did not stop. When she tried to protest, he shook his head once. "Winter's coming," he said shortly. "This place is too small." Only then did she understand. He wasn't gathering firewood. He was building. The word hovered between them, unspoken, immense. He was raising something meant to endure. Not a temporary refuge, but a home, a stronghold against cold, hunger, and the men who hunted them. The sound of the axe became the heartbeat of their days. From dawn until dusk, he worked, cutting, stripping bark, shaping logs with a skill both brutal and exact. Willa could not lift the timbers, but she cleared brush, fetched water, kept the fire ready for meals. She learned to read him, a tool placed in his hand before he asked, coffee waiting when he paused to rest. They worked mostly in silence. It was not empty silence, but shared purpose. One morning, she noticed him measuring the same straight pine log for the third time. He knelt amid curls of pale shavings, charcoal tied to string stretched carefully along its length. "You've measured that one 3 times, she said, smiling softly. He looked up, expression serious. "So when you look out the window," he said, voice low, "nothing feels crooked." The words struck her harder than any declaration could have. He wasn't just shaping walls, he was shaping how she would see the world from inside them. He had already chosen where her window would be. On the eastern side, where morning light would spill across the table she used for sewing and reading. Life settled into this new rhythm. Mornings brought rifle practice, the sharp crack of a shot echoing through clean mountain air. Afternoons were for building, the scent of fresh-cut pine thick in the wind. Evenings were quiet, spent near the hearth as corn roasted in embers, and the smell of gun oil mingled with wood smoke. Willa felt herself changing. Fear still lived inside her, a cold stone low in her belly, but it no longer ruled her. It had become something she carried, not something that carried her. Her hands, once soft and meant only for needlework, were now rough and capable. She could load a rifle, cook over open flame, tell by the sound of the axe whether the blade had dulled. She was becoming part of the mountain itself, hardened, enduring, and no longer willing to be driven away. Strong as the pines gripping the stone ridges around them, Willa Dane had learned to endure. Nearly a month after the confrontation at the town hall, their provisions began to thin. It was Thorne Kess who made the trip down to Hollow Creek. He carried his rifle across his arm, his expression closed and unreadable as ever. Willa waited through the long hours he was gone, unease coiling tight in her chest with every passing moment. She sat on the porch of their half-raised cabin, the bare timbers standing like ribs around her, practicing her aim with the spare rifle, lifting, sighting, lowering, over and over, at imagined shapes between the trees. He returned near sundown, leading the mule laden with heavy sacks of flour and salt. Dust clung to his boots. His face was tired, but he was unharmed. He said little about what had passed in town, yet the contents of the packs spoke clearly enough. Alongside the supplies sat a thick canvas sack that clinked with weight. "Nails," Thorne said gruffly as he loosened the tie. "Garin Holt sent them. Said no man ought to build a house with wooden pegs if iron's to be had." Willa stared at the contents. Dozens of forged nails, valuable as coin on the frontier. The blacksmith, the man who'd muttered "the mountain man speaks." It wasn't charity. It was acknowledgement. A few days later, another sign came climbing up the trail. Jory Finch arrived breathless but determined, a bulky bundle cradled in his arms. He avoided her eyes as he passed it to her. "From Elsbeth Moore, ma'am," he said. "She said she had extra." Inside the cloth wrapping were flour and sugar, but also a small jar of yeast and a loaf of bread, still warm at its center. Real bread. The scent alone brought tears to Willa's eyes. Elizabeth, the woman with flour always dusting her apron, the one who'd whispered, "He hits the mark." The Hollow Creek women had tried to shame her into vanishing. But this woman, with kind hands and a gentle heart, had chosen compassion instead. The town, she realized, was not one voice. It was many. And some of those voices were quietly standing with them. Even Sheriff Corwin Hale appeared. One afternoon, he rode into the clearing, stopping short of the cabin's edge. He did not dismount. He merely observed the stacked firewood, The straight lines of the new structure, the calm rhythm between Willa and Thorn as they worked. He watched her practice with the rifle, posture steady. He watched Thorn lift a heavy beam into place, his shoulder nearly healed. After a long moment, the sheriff tipped his hat. Not quite a salute, but no longer suspicion either. Then he turned his horse and rode away. The new cabin rose piece by piece. It was larger than the old one. 2 rooms, 2 windows. One faced east. The day Thorn fitted the frame into that window felt like victory. He smoothed his hand across the sanded wood, checking the join twice. Then, thinking her distracted, he drew his knife. With a few careful strokes, he carved a small letter, almost invisible, into the inner edge of the frame. An N, where his hand would pass every time the shutter opened or closed. A quiet claim, a private truth. As the first snow brushed the highest peaks, the cabin stood nearly complete. A strong cedar roof, a wide stone hearth that drew clean, warmth that stayed. It felt like safety. One evening, seated before the first fire in the new hearth, Thorn reached into his pocket. He drew out a small wooden box, no larger than his palm. Aspen wood, polished smooth, the lid carved with entwined pine needles. He placed it in her hands. Willa opened it slowly. Inside, resting on soft moss, lay 2 rings. Not gold, not silver, carved from dark walnut wood, polished until they gleamed. Simple, honest, perfect. She lifted her eyes to him, unable to speak. Firelight softened the lines of his face, revealing something rarely seen: vulnerability. "The circuit preacher will be in Hollow Creek in 2 weeks," he said quietly. "He could ride up here?" He hesitated, searching for words that didn't come easily. "If you're still willing," he murmured, "we could say the vows." It wasn't poetry. It wasn't romance from a book. It was choice, after fear, after judgment, after survival. Was she willing to choose him, not as refuge, but as home? Tears slid freely down her cheeks, not from sorrow, from belonging. She had been sent west like cargo, promised to a man she never met, lost and frightened beyond measure. Now she was being asked, given a choice. She reached for his large, calloused hand and held it between both of hers. Then she lifted it gently to her lips and kissed his knuckles. Without hesitation, without fear, without running. "I am willing," Willa Dane said, her voice steady and unshaken. The preparations began the very next morning. There would be no lace gown, no crowded church, no rows of curious faces whispering behind gloved hands. Their wedding would mirror the life they had chosen, plain, honest, and stripped down to what truly mattered. They would be married on the mountainside, in a narrow meadow scattered with late-blooming wildflowers that had somehow survived the first hard frosts, stubborn and beautiful in defiance of the cold. They cleared a small patch of earth together. Thorn Kess shaped several rough benches from fallen timber, simple seats meant only for those few they would invite. Garin Holt, the blacksmith, Elsbeth Moore, the baker's wife, and perhaps even the quiet, watchful Sheriff Corwin Hale. It would be a wedding of few voices and much wind. Under the endless sky of the Montana frontier, it would belong only to them. The day arrived carried on a sharp autumn breeze. It was a restless wind, clean and lively, the kind that swept clouds from the heavens and left the sky stretched wide and aching blue. It carried the scent of pine, distant snow, and the dry sweetness of the wildflowers dotting their meadow. The clearing itself rested like a hidden shelf along the mountainside, a rare softness carved into unforgiving stone. From its edge, forested ridges rolled outward into deep shadowed valleys that reached toward the far horizon. Their guests arrived not by carriage, but on foot and horseback, making the slow climb from Hollow Creek. There were only 4. Garen Holt looked deeply uncomfortable, his massive frame squeezed into a Sunday coat too tight across the shoulders. He carried a heavy parcel wrapped clumsily in burlap, which he handed to Thorne with a short grunt. Elsbeth Moore arrived smiling despite the climb, her cheeks flushed red from the cold and effort. She presented Willa with a small 3-tier cake, a miracle of flour and sugar, decorated with crystallized violets she had saved for something special. Sheriff Corwin Hale came last. He said little, his presence solid and steady as the mountain beneath their feet. He tipped his hat once in acknowledgement. No ceremony, no suspicion, only respect. Then came Pastor Eben Roren, a circuit preacher worn thin by miles of trail and bitter winters. His coat was faded, his boots scarred, but his eyes held a quiet kindness earned from years of blessing people who lived hard lives. Willa wore the same dark wool dress she had arrived in months earlier, the one she had once stood in while being judged. Today, she reclaimed it. She had sewn a new collar of clean white linen at the neckline. Elsbeth had helped her weave a small crown of purple asters into her tightly braided hair. In her hands, she carried a simple bouquet of the same wildflowers, bound together with twine. She was not a bride from a storybook. She was a woman standing at the edge of the world, choosing where she belonged. Thorne wore a clean linen shirt, a rare concession to ceremony, but kept his buckskins and boots. He looked as though the mountain itself had shaped him, a force of nature paused for one sacred moment in the form of a man. As Willa crossed the meadow toward him, the wind pressed her dress against her legs. Thorne watched her approach, and something softened in his face. He was a man who had long forgotten how to hope, and now hope walked toward him. They stood before the preacher with the sky as their witness and the mountains as their cathedral. Behind them, their few guests formed a small, loyal half-circle. Pastor Eben Roren's voice, thin but steady, carried on the wind as he spoke of companionship and hardship, of building a home not only with logs and nails, but with courage and devotion. When the time came for vows, the preacher turned to Thorne. But Thorne did not speak. Instead, he did something that drew a sharp breath from Elsbeth and made Garen Holt's jaw fall open. He went down on one knee before Willa. The gesture was so unexpected, so powerful, that even the wind seemed to still. He did not look at her face. He took her right hand gently in both of his, studied it. His thumb traced the calluses on her palm, the faint scar on her knuckle where a needle had once slipped. This was the hand he had seen kneading dough, mending cloth, binding wounds, and holding a rifle without trembling. He lifted it and pressed a kiss to the back of her hand. The act felt more sacred than any prayer. Then he looked up at her. His gray eyes shone with something raw and unguarded. "These are the strongest hands I have ever known," he whispered, "meant for her alone." Tears streamed freely down Willa's cheeks, but she was smiling. In that moment, she was not an orphan, not a mail-order bride, not the subject of Hollow Creek gossip. She was a woman honored for her strength, cherished for the scars life had carved into her. She cupped his bearded cheek gently. "Rise, my husband," she said softly, "and stand beside me." He rose to his full height, and they turned once more to Pastor Eben Roren, their hands clasped together. Their vows were not long passages memorized from a prayer book. With the wisdom of a man who had married couples beneath storms and stars alike, the preacher asked only what mattered. "Thorne Kess," he said, "do you take this woman, Willa Dane, to be your lawful wife?" to live together in honesty, to love her, shelter her, and stand with her in sickness and in health, forsaking all others so long as you both shall live. Keep yourself only unto her, for as long as you both shall live. Thorn Kest never looked away from Willa Dane's face. I do, he said. His voice was steady and certain, a vow strong enough that even the mountain wind could not carry it away. Willa Dane, Pastor Eben Roran continued, do you take this man, Thorn Kest, to be your lawful husband, to live together in this sacred union, to love him, comfort him, honor and keep him, in sickness and in health, forsaking all others, and keeping yourself only unto him so long as you both shall live? Her fingers tightened around his. I do, she said. The words rang clear, filled with a certainty that settled deep in her bones. Then by the authority granted to me by God and the territory of Montana, the preacher declared, his voice lifting with warmth, I now pronounce you husband and wife. For a heartbeat, they simply stood there. The world fell away. Then Thorn's face, so long carved by grief and endurance, broke into a slow, rare smile that transformed him completely. He bent his head and kissed her. Not with urgency, not with hunger, but with a quiet, solemn promise that sealed their vows more surely than any spoken words. A soft burst of applause followed. Not loud, not grand, but the thunderous clapping of Garen Holt's massive hands, joined by the eager patter of Elsbeth Moore's gloved palms. It sounded like a gentle rain after a long drought. Even Sheriff Corwin Hale allowed a small, rough smile to touch his face. The weight of the past month seemed to lift into the thin mountain air. Garen Holt opened his parcel, revealing a finely wrought iron fireplace set. Each piece twisted into the shape of pine branches, heavy and enduring. Elsbeth busied herself with the cake, cutting generous slices for everyone. Laughter, rare and precious on this part of the mountain, rang freely across the meadow. Garen told a story about a stubborn mule that refused to cross a creek. Even Thorn offered a dry, understated remark that drew a surprised chuckle from the sheriff. Someone, perhaps Elsbeth, began to hum a simple waltz. Thorn glanced at Willa, a silent question in his eyes. She smiled and nodded. He took her hand, and together they stepped onto the uneven grass. Their dance was clumsy and imperfect. He was too large, his steps heavy. She was unused to being guided, her boots tangling with his. But they laughed, open, genuine laughter, more beautiful than any polished ballroom grace. They were two people who did not know the steps, so they made their own. Yet they were not entirely alone. Far up the slope, hidden within a thick stand of pine at the edge of the tree line, a man lay flat against the earth. He was distant enough to remain unseen, but close enough that the figures in the meadow appeared sharp through the brass spyglass pressed to his eye. He had watched everything. His mouth twisted in contempt. He saw the blacksmith, the baker's wife. He noted the presence of the sheriff. He watched the giant kneel before the woman. He watched them kiss. Now he watched them laugh and stumble through their foolish dance. Each burst of laughter cut him like a blade. This was not how it was meant to end. The girl was supposed to be broken, disgraced, cast aside to pay for her father's sins. She was meant to belong to him, his to control, his to ruin. Instead, she had found protection. She had found allies. She had found a home. She had found joy. Calder Voss slowly lowered the spyglass. His eyes, small, dark and merciless in his sallow face, held no warmth, no humor, only patience, only a quiet, simmering hatred, a promise of a storm yet to come. one meant to snuff out the fragile flame of their wedding day. The watcher in the pines did not smile. The weeks that followed were a blessing, a pocket of impossible peace in a life that had known little of it. The wind still swept the mountain, but now it was only wind, not a bearer of threats or whispers. The place that had once been exile had become sanctuary. They settled fully into the new cabin, its 2 rooms feeling as grand as any mansion. Just as Thorn had promised, the morning sun poured through the eastern window, lighting the table where Willa kept her mending basket and the single book she owned. The small carved letter in the window frame remained their quiet secret, an unseen smile between them. The first snow arrived as a pale dusting, turning the world silver, beautiful and solemn, a warning. Winter was closing its grip around the mountain. They would need one final journey to Hollow Creek for the supplies that would carry them through until spring: sacks of grain, barrels of salted meat, kerosene for the lamps. The morning Thorn set out. The sky hung low and heavy like a sheet of lead. The air was unnaturally still, the cold deep and watchful. Willa stood on the porch and watched him lead the mule down the trail until he became only a dark speck against the vast, somber land. "The sky looks angry," she said, unease tightening her chest. "I'll be back before it breaks," he promised, his hand brushing her cheek. But the sky did not wait. By midday, the silence shattered. The wind rose in a low, mournful moan, climbing into a sharp, screaming howl. And the first snowflakes began to fall. Not the soft, drifting snow from earlier. These were hard pellets of ice that cut against the skin like gravel. Within an hour, the world beyond the window vanished into a violent white churn, the wind screaming as if the mountain itself had turned hostile. The trail to Hollow Creek was gone, buried, treacherous, a maze of hidden stone and sudden drifts. Thorn Kess was trapped out there, and he was not alone. Willa Dane knew it with a certainty colder than the storm itself. Panic, old and familiar, rose fast in her chest, clawing toward her throat. She forced it down with sheer will, replacing it with a sharp, burning resolve. She would not wait helplessly for fate. She was Thorn's wife, and this was her home. She moved with purpose. First, she took the large storm lantern, filled it with oil, and struck the flame. She adjusted the wick until it burned bright and steady, then set it squarely in the east window, a beacon cutting through the swirling chaos, a signal for Thorn, and a challenge to anyone else. Next, she gathered the empty tin cans she had saved and tied them together with long strands of twine. Fighting the wind that tore at her skirts, she worked quickly, stringing a rough web around the cabin, trip lines and clattering metal circling the structure. Any approach would be heard. She went back inside, dropped the heavy bar across the door, and reached for the spare rifle. She loaded it calmly. The click of the cartridge sliding home felt solid, reassuring against the roar of the storm. Then she took the chair facing the door, rested the rifle across her lap, and waited. Thorn sensed the ambush before he saw it. The air itself felt wrong, thick with menace separate from the storm. Snow-laden trees leaned inward along the narrow trail, pressing close as if watching. He guided the mule through a tight cut between 2 massive rock faces when the first shot cracked. The wind swallowed the sound almost instantly. The bullet ripped through a sack of flour on the mule's back, bursting into a cloud of white that vanished into the storm. The animal screamed and reared. Thorn dove from the trail, rolling behind a boulder crusted with snow as 2 more shots shattered stone and ice where he had stood moments earlier. He saw them then, 3 figures in heavy coats, dark shapes moving with purpose. Calder Voss and 2 others. A straight fight would mean death. He was outnumbered, and the blizzard hid their movement like a cloak. But he had one advantage. This mountain belonged to him. Every ravine, every ledge, every place where the earth could turn deadly. He fired a single shot, not to hit, but to force them down. Then he abandoned the mule and the scattered supplies and slipped into the storm, not toward safety, but upward, deeper into the mountain's grasp. He was leading them toward a place he knew well. A narrow canyon of sheer rock walls where the wind became a living thing, violent, screaming, capable of tearing a man from his feet. Back at the cabin, time dragged like a wounded animal. Willa did not rise from her chair. The storm battered the walls, rattled the shutters, buried the foundation in snow. The world outside dissolved into endless white noise. Then she heard it, a faint, frantic clatter. Tin striking tin. Someone had crossed the line. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she stood, the rifle heavy and familiar in her hands. She moved to the side of the door, pressing her back against the rough logs. Footsteps crunched on the porch, heavy, uneven in the deep snow. A gloved hand rattled the latch. "Thorn?" she called, her voice tight. Silence. Then the scrape of metal. A blade wedged into the doorframe, prying hard against the bar. "He's not coming back," a rasping voice sneered from outside. Calder Voss. "He's lying dead in the snow. It's just you and me now, Willa, and we've got a debt to settle." The knife splintered wood, but the bar held. A curse followed, then a violent crash as his shoulders slammed into the door. The logs groaned, yet stood firm. Willa raised the rifle, sighting the center of the door, her finger resting just short of the trigger. She remembered Thorn's rule: only when there is no other way. Then the assault stopped. Footsteps retreated, moving sideways, toward the window, toward the lantern. Realization struck a heartbeat too late. Wood shattered. Oiled paper tore. The butt of a rifle smashed through the frame. A blast of wind and snow exploded into the cabin. The lantern toppled, its flame snuffed instantly, plunging the room into shadow lit only by the dying fire. Before she could reposition, he was climbing through the broken window, lean, wiry, coated in snow, his face twisted with triumph. He lifted his rifle. But in that moment of chaos and darkness, Willa did not scream. She spoke. "My father sent your brother to the gallows because he was a murderer," she said. Her voice cut through the storm, steady, fearless. "Calder," she continued, calm as the wind howled around them, "and you know it. Is that the debt you came to collect?" Willa Dane said steadily. "Just to prove him right?" Calder Voss froze. His rifle hovered halfway between threat and doubt. Her words, unexpected, calm, cut straight through his momentum. "He shamed my family." Calder spat, his voice trembling with rage. "Your father, hiding behind his laws, took everything from us." "He took a murderer from this world," Willa answered, her own rifle held firm though the darkness hid it from his sight. "What you call disgrace, he called justice. There is a difference, and your hatred has blinded you to it." "Justice," Calder sneered, stepping closer. "This is justice, an eye for an eye. Your life for my brother's." "That isn't justice," she replied quietly. "Calder, that's pride." Her voice softened, not weak, but sorrowful. "You aren't here for your brother. You're here for yourself. You can't bear the thought that your family was wrong. You'd rather become a killer than face that truth." He stared at her, jaw working, words failing him. She had struck something deep, peeled away the armor of righteous fury. and expose the hollow thing beneath. He wasn't an avenger. He was a man drowning in wounded pride, clinging to violence because it was all he had left. That hesitation cost him. The cabin door burst open. A massive, snow-drenched figure filled the doorway. Thorn Kess, alive. His face was carved from fury, breath steaming in the cold air, rifle leveled without hesitation. Behind him emerged more shapes through the swirling snow. Garen Holt stood broad and unyielding, an axe clenched in his fists. Sheriff Corwin Hale followed, pistol drawn, eyes sharp. 2 Hollow Creek men came behind him, armed and resolute. They had seen the light. The steady lantern in the window had guided them through the storm. Calder's face collapsed. The hatred, the arrogance, the certainty, all of it drained away, replaced by raw fear. There would be no glorious revenge, no legend, only a cold room and the people he despised standing around him. His rifle slipped from his hands and clattered to the floor. They found his 2 companions later, huddled in a shallow rock cave not far from the canyon Thorn had drawn them into. One had taken a bullet in the leg, fired in blind panic by his own partner. The other was half frozen, fingers and toes black with frostbite. They had not been defeated by Thorn. They had been defeated by the mountain, by greed, by foolishness. The 3 men were brought back to the cabin, wrists bound. The storm was already breaking. The wind softened. The night loosened its grip. As pale dawn filtered through the shattered window, a council formed in the quiet room. "They'll hang for this," Garen Holt growled, satisfaction low in his voice. "And good riddance." Sheriff Corwin Hale nodded. Frontier justice is swift. Willa looked at Thorn. He met her gaze. A silent question passed between them. This was their home, their sanctuary. These men had violated it, threatened everything they had built. By the laws of this land, they had every right to take vengeance. She thought of her father, Judge Halden Price, and the law he had served. She thought of Calder's twisted face. An eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. She stepped forward. "No," Willa said clearly. All eyes turned to her. "You'll take them back to Hollow Creek. They'll wait for the circuit judge. They'll stand trial." The men stared, stunned. "This house," Thorn said quietly, placing his hand on her shoulder, "was built on truth, not on bodies." The decision settled like stone. They would choose law, not revenge. They would choose light, not the darkness that had hunted them for so long. Later, after the sheriff and his small posse departed with the prisoners, leading them down the newly passable trail, Willa stood in the doorway of her home. The storm was gone. The world lay silent beneath clean, untouched snow. The air was sharp and pure. Her body trembled, not from fear, but release. A deep, exhausted shaking. Yet she did not feel broken. She felt cleansed. Her gaze fell on the storm lantern near the hearth. Its glass shattered, its flame gone, but its light had been enough. That small, fragile glow had pierced the worst storm the mountain could summon and led an entire town to their door. It had been enough. The winter that followed was long and heavy, a season of quiet, a season of healing. The mountain wrapped them in deep silence, burying the world beneath snow, and at last, granting them peace. Thorn Kess, with help from Garen Holt, rebuilt the east window with a stronger frame. This time, it held a true glass pane, ordered all the way from Helena. It was an indulgence by frontier standards, a rare miracle of clean clarity. Willa Dane often stood before it in the long winter mornings, gazing out across the untouched white valley. The weak sun brushed her face, and she marveled at how a view once shaped by dread had become a picture of calm. News from the world below arrived only in fragments, carried upward by Sheriff Corwin Hale or Garin Holt during their infrequent visits. Word of Calder Voss's trial spread quickly through the territory. The circuit judge, a stern but measured man, had listened closely to the testimony. Sheriff Corwin Hale spoke first, then Thorne, and finally Willa herself. Her voice, steady and unshaken, had filled the stuffy Hollow Creek courtroom. She spoke not of revenge nor fear, but of law and of how old hatred poisons generations if left unchecked. Calder Voss and the Voss riders were not hanged. Instead, they were sentenced to 20 years of hard labor in the territorial prison. When Garin Holt delivered the news, he shook his head with reluctant respect. The judge said your way was the harder one, he admitted. But the better one, said Montana needs to start building something stronger than graveyards. With the coming of spring, the mountain itself seemed reborn. Snow withdrew inch by inch, uncovering dark, fertile soil. Aspen branches swelled with pale green buds. Meltwater rushed through the creeks, singing loud and reckless songs down the slopes. And with that thaw came something deeper. The final chill between the mountain and Hollow Creek dissolved. When Willa and Thorne rode down for supplies, the difference was unmistakable. There were no whispers, no sideways glances. Men tipped their hats as Thorne passed. Women offered Willa small, honest smiles. Mercer Lane, the mercantile owner, greeted them warmly. "Good day, Mr. and Mrs. Kess." Their story had become part of the town's own memory, a painful chapter that had ended not in blood, but in grace. The greatest change came from the Hollow Creek women. Dorothea Vane still stood firm in her disapproval, but her influence had cracked. One afternoon, as Willa spoke with Elsbeth Moore inside the bakery, another woman approached hesitantly. Her name was Eleanor Vance, once a silent, judging face in the town hall. She twisted the strings of her handbag, eyes lowered. "Mrs. Kess," she said softly, "I feel I owe you an apology." She glanced around to be certain Dorothea Vane was nowhere near. "We saw something we didn't understand, and chose the cruelest explanation. We spoke of propriety when we should have offered protection." Her voice trembled. "What you endured, and the dignity you carried through it, has forced many of us to examine our own faith." Their eyes met. For the first time, Willa did not see a judge, only another woman. "We were wrong," Eleanor said quietly. "I am truly sorry." Willa's throat tightened. She hadn't realized how deep the wound still lay. "Thank you, Mrs. Vance," she said gently. "I accept." Relief washed over the woman's face before she hurried away. The past had finally loosened its grip, not through punishment, but through truth spoken aloud. Willa had arrived on this mountain as a girl, sent, traded, powerless. That girl no longer existed. In her place stood a woman who had chosen to trust, chosen to fight, chosen to love, chosen to remain. She was not owner of the mountain, but she belonged to it. Thorne, too, had changed. The grieving giant who once hid from the world had stepped back into it. The man who spoke rarely now spoke when it mattered. His words few, but weighted with meaning. He was no longer merely a mountain man. He was a husband, a builder, a cornerstone of a quieter, fairer kind of community, one shaped by respect rather than fear. One evening in early summer, they sat together on the porch. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Above them, Countless stars spilled across the sky, so close it felt as if one could stir them with a hand. Willa rested her head against Thorn's shoulder. His arms circled her with steady warmth. The wooden ring on her finger held the day's heat. "I was thinking," she said softly, "that patch by the creek where the sun lingers longest. I'd like to plant an herb garden there. Mint, thyme, maybe lavender, if it'll take." Thorn was quiet for a long moment. She felt the slow rise and fall of his chest. "A good place," he said at last. "I'll build a fence. Keep the deer out." They fell into silence again, not empty, but complete, watching the stars as the mountain breathed around them. The future no longer felt like a dark land waiting to swallow them whole. It was something they were shaping with their own hands, one decision at a time, one honest day after another. "Garen Holt was telling me," Willa Dane said softly, "that the families beyond the far ridge, their children don't have any schooling." The night breeze carried her words into the pines. "It's too far for them to ride into Hollow Creek," she continued, then hesitated as a new idea slowly formed. "I was thinking, once the garden is planted, once the house is truly settled, maybe we could open our doors 2 days a week. Just 2. She lifted her gaze to the stars. "They could come here. I could teach them their letters, their numbers." She felt Thorn Kest turn toward her, his movement slow and thoughtful in the starlight. It was a daring notion, to turn their hard-won refuge into a place of learning, to invite others in after fighting so fiercely to keep danger out, to let light travel outward instead of hiding it behind walls. For a long while, he said nothing. Then he bent and pressed his lips gently to her hair. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, filled with a depth of feeling that matched the endless sky above them. "Our home will always face outward," he said. "A shelter for those who've lost their way." Willa closed her eyes. A calm unlike anything she had ever known settled into her bones. She was not lost anymore. Inside the cabin, the lamp burned near the window. Its glow spilled into the night, not trembling, not faltering, but steady and warm, no longer a warning against danger, but an invitation. The path up Briar Ridge, once a narrow trail that led her toward fear and uncertainty, had changed. Now it led home. "Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Your presence means more than you know. If today's story awakened something inside you, don't let the trail end here. There are many more tales of courage, devotion, and faith waiting to be discovered. Subscribe, comment, share, and come back as we continue this unforgettable journey. Thank you, truly. Aviso legal barra disclaimer. All stories are intended solely for entertainment and may include fictionalized scenarios or dramatization derived from historical contexts. While AI assists in production, human creators supervise and adjust every piece to maintain sincerity, credibility, and emotional quality. We adhere entirely to platform regulations regarding AI content, ensuring no deepfakes or misleading portrayals. Licensed materials are used responsibly. Republishing, modifying, or extracting content without authorization is not allowed. We appreciate every viewer who respects originality and creative effort.